Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 1988 anime film Akira, or Akira, depending on which dub of the movie you watch. Now, Akira was written and directed by Katsuhiro Otomo, and the movie is based on his manga series of the same name. Now, the manga series was published between the years 1982 and 1990, so this movie actually came out 2 years before the comic book series was even completed. Now, later on in this video, I will address some of the major differences between this movie and the manga, but to be honest though, even I'm not going to be able to touch on every single difference. Now, if you really want to get a sense of how different this movie is from the manga, just watch my reviews of all 6 volumes of the manga series, and you'll get a real sense of how different this movie is from the source material, or better yet, actually read them. Now, the entire manga series put together is 2,000 pages long, and this movie is only 2 hours long, so as you can imagine, a lot is condensed, a lot is left out, and a lot is outright changed from the original manga. But to be honest though, I actually don't mind that, and personally I love this movie. At the same time though, I'm not sure if I would love the movie as much had I read the manga first, because I did see this movie before I read the manga series, and I could understand somebody who is maybe like a huge fan of the manga absolutely despising this movie. In a lot of ways, you could probably compare this movie to the recent movie The Dark Tower, which is based on the series of books by Stephen King. That movie essentially did the same thing that this movie did. It actually combined elements from all 8 books in that series all together into one movie. And I personally hated that movie, but also I'm a diehard fan of the Dark Tower books, so I kind of have a feeling that a lot of people who were big fans of the manga back when this movie came out probably felt the same way about this movie that I did about the recent Dark Tower movie. And in a lot of ways, you could almost look at this movie as just being a preview for what's in the manga. But I think if you look at the movie's timeline and the timeline of the manga series as just being 2 separate continuities, and you think of them as being 2 separate stories, I think you'll enjoy this movie a lot more. Now, I'll be honest, I'm very much a novice when it comes to mangas and anime. Only recently, like in the last few years, did I really start getting into it, and by no means am I a diehard fan. But while I'm not a diehard anime fan, I really do love this movie, and I love the manga series upon which this movie is based. Now, I first discovered this movie a couple of years ago. Like, I was checking out a video of, like, the top 10 anime films, and this was number 1, and in the video they showed scenes from this movie, particularly the end of the movie, and once again, I'm not a diehard anime fan, but when I saw those particular clips from this movie, I was like, okay, I have to see that fucking movie. And I eventually did see the movie and absolutely fell in love with it, and one of the reasons why I fell in love with this is because I really do feel like it transcends the anime genre. Like, I could recommend this movie even if you're not an anime fan, because it's a great science fiction movie, and I can recommend this for fans of science fiction. It's a cyberpunk movie, it's a dystopian movie, it's an action movie, and if you like those genres, I think you will definitely like this movie, but the movie even goes beyond those genres. It's also a political thriller, it's kind of a mystery film, it's an espionage drama, it's a body horror film, it's a surrealist film. Like, there's so many different genres at work in this movie, and it also touches on a lot of deeper political and social themes. Now, in some ways, the best way I could describe this movie is imagine a hybrid between Stephen King's Carrie, David Cronenberg's Scanners, Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, and Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, which of course was based on the Philip K. Dick novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Like, imagine a hybrid between all those stories with a hint of a film from Jodorowsky or David Lynch. Like, imagine all of those things put together, and the result would be something similar to Akira, but even that's not giving Akira the credit it deserves, because, while it certainly takes plot elements from the stories I've mentioned, it's also a very original film, and in a lot of ways is unlike a lot of things. It takes elements from the stories I've mentioned, but definitely does its own thing with them. Now, the plot of Akira is it's set 31 years after World War III, which started when a mysterious explosion destroyed the city of Tokyo in 1988. Now the year is 2019, which is actually kind of funny how when this movie came out that was the future, and now that's only a year away. But basically, the year is 2019, and the world has mostly rebuilt itself since the Third World War, but Japan is now under the control of a very corrupt and ineffectual government, and the police is very militaristic, and the city of Tokyo has been replaced with Neo-Tokyo, which is a city plagued by gang violence, overpopulation, and domestic terrorism. Now, in the beginning of the film, it follows this motorcycle gang. One of the members of this gang is an emotionally disturbed teenager named Tetsuo Shima, and in the beginning of the film, they're in a battle with a rival gang known as the Clowns. And after fucking up one of the clowns, Tetsuo has an encounter with what appears to be a little boy with telekinetic powers, and after this encounter, the military comes and takes this little boy away, but they also take Tetsuo as well. Tetsuo does eventually escape, but he's taken by them again, and Tetsuo's best friend Kaneda, who's the gang's leader, is trying to figure out what exactly happened to Tetsuo and what they're doing to him, and in the movie, he more or less becomes a member of this underground terrorist organization, mainly so he can figure out what happened to Tetsuo, but also because he has the hots for this girl named Kei, who is a member of this organization. And it turns out that Tetsuo has now developed telekinetic powers of his own, and he's now developing into an extremely powerful psychic. But these powers are causing him to become even more unstable, and eventually Tetsuo goes on a rampage, and the Japanese government is powerless against him, and eventually Kaneda realizes that he may have to kill his former best friend. And as the movie goes on, you also realize that these powers are causing Tetsuo's body to physically change, and eventually at the end of the movie, and this is sort of a minor spoiler, but at the end of the movie, Tetsuo does mutate into a giant blob-like creature. Now, that plotline that I explained, believe it or not, is just the main plotline. There are actually several plotlines going on in this movie, but that's the main overarching plot. There's also a subplot in the movie about how the Kernel, who is part of this top-secret government project experimenting on psychic children, there's a subplot about him starting a coup against the Japanese government. There's also the plotline of this terrorist organization that is trying to bring down the Japanese government, and it turns out that they actually have a member of the Japanese government working with them. Also, in the movie, you find out that this explosion, which started World War III, was actually caused by an extremely powerful psychic named Akira, and it turns out that ever since then, there have been certain people who worship Akira as almost like a god or a messiah, and when Tetsuo reveals his powers to the public of Neo-Tokyo, there are certain people who believe that Tetsuo is the second coming of Akira. So there's a lot going on in this movie, and I think one of the reasons why a lot of people don't like this movie is because it just crams so much into a 2-hour-long film, whereas in the manga, like all the stuff I mentioned, a lot of that stuff is in the manga, but since the manga is 2,000 pages long, there's a lot more time to develop a lot of that where it doesn't feel all convoluted. That being said, however, I still really enjoy this movie, and I don't even think the movie's that confusing. Like, a lot of people say the film is too confusing. I really don't think it is. It's just a lot going on in one movie. But also, I saw this movie multiple times now, so I think I got a better grasp on everything that's going on in the movie than somebody somebody who maybe only saw the movie once. Now, of course, there are a lot of deeper themes in this movie, but admittedly, a lot of the themes of this film are kind of just crammed together or are just kind of briefly glossed over, whereas in the manga, the themes and ideas are much more fleshed out. Now, I would say one of the major themes of both this movie and the manga upon which this movie is based is corruption. Not just government corruption, which you do see in the movie, but also a more personal corruption on Tetsuo's part, where it's sort of a corruption of both the body and the soul. Now, one of the major themes of the manga is drug addiction, because in the manga, Tetsuo becomes addicted to these pills which suppress his powers, but also cure these crippling headaches that his powers unfortunately give him, and the manga focuses a lot on Tetsuo's dependence on these pills, whereas the movie kind of just glosses over it a little bit. But another major theme in both this movie and the manga is really nuclear warfare, because Akira, in a lot of ways, is essentially a metaphor for the atom bomb, and the beginning of the movie where you see Tokyo get destroyed, it's impossible not to think of stuff like the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. In that sense, you could very much compare this film to the original Godzilla, which is also a film that was definitely making a commentary on the atom bomb. And the movie does have a really interesting, almost Ouroboros effect, where the movie begins with destruction and ends with destruction. The movie is also almost a Frankenstein-esque kind of story about science gone wrong and what happens when man tries to play God and when man tampers with forces that they don't understand. Now, in the manga, there was a lot of commentary on belief systems and faith and what we put our faith in, and really religion in general. There was even this whole idea in the manga that what if Akira was essentially a vessel for the very essence of the universe itself, like the very force that holds the universe together, perhaps even God incarnate. And the movie has some religious undertones, but definitely not to the same extent as the manga. Now, I know it might seem like I'm just giving people reasons to read the manga instead of watch the movie. I'm not really trying to do that. I mean, don't get me wrong, I recommend reading the manga because it's damn good, but that's not to say that this movie doesn't have merits. I'm just saying that a lot of the deeper themes in this film are much more fleshed out in the manga, whereas in the movie, I feel like they're more glossed over. But one theme you very much see in this film is government corruption and political apathy. Like, in the movie, you just see how ineffectual this government really is, and how sleazy some of the politicians are, and you just see them, like, not being able to agree on anything, and nothing's getting done. And it's really this political corruption which has led Neo-Tokyo to being this gang-rated hellhole. And in the movie, you see the Kernel trying to start a coup against the government, but at the same time, though, the government he seems to want to put in place is definitely a much more militaristic government and much more of a totalitarian government. But one theme you definitely see in this movie is this idea of the younger generation versus the older generation, where Neo-Tokyo, a lot of the reasons why it's the way it is really because of the older generation and the sins of the older generation. And ultimately, you have this younger generation in the film, which is going to inherit what the older generation leaves behind for them. And a lot of the main conflicts in the film are happening because of Akira, but Akira was a direct result of the arrogance of the older generation. Now, I'm not going to pretend to understand every single theme that's at work in this movie, because I'm sure a lot of it is directly tying in with actual Japanese culture at the time, which I'm hardly an expert on, and I'll fully admit that. But once again, one of the main themes of this movie is definitely the idea of the younger generation paying for the sins of the older generation. And a lot of the main characters of the movie are these disenfranchised youths, and Tetsuo in a lot of ways is just kind of getting revenge on the very society that cast him out. Now, I know I'm 12 or 13 minutes into this, and I haven't even touched on the animation in the film, and the animation is just breathtaking. And I'll admit that I don't really know much about animation, mainly because I can't draw to save my life, but the fact that somebody actually drew this is just so amazing to me. I mean, obviously it was a team of people, but you had a team of people actually sitting down and drawing this shit. That is just so freaking impressive to me, it's not even funny. Especially because a lot of scenes take place at night, and I do believe it's very difficult to animate stuff that takes place at night. And this movie broke so much ground for animation back in 1988. And also, the score for this movie is just fantastic. Like, the score very much adds a distinct mood and atmosphere to this film. And it's a very haunting score as well. Especially some of the scenes that take place when Tetsuo is a child. They play this, like, very melancholy kind of music that really fits the tone of the scenes. There's also a scene in the movie where Tetsuo's at this government-run hospital, and the psychic children known as the Espers start fucking with Tetsuo in this really bizarre sequence, and they play this really freaking creepy music over the scene, which fits the tone of the scene so well. Now I want to talk about some of the characters in the film. Now, there are a couple of characters in this movie who could qualify as main characters, but there are 4 characters in particular that I really want to touch on. One of them, of course, is Tetsuo, who is the main antagonist of the movie. And Tetsuo is a very compelling character who is a sympathetic character to a certain extent, because you realize that he was bullied growing up and has always been picked on, and over the years has kind of developed sort of an inferiority complex, and you realize that he's psychotically jealous of Kaneda. And Kaneda over the years has treated Tetsuo as sort of like a younger brother, but Tetsuo has always sort of taken this the wrong way, and has taken this as Kaneda really looking down on him, whereas Kaneda probably would say that it was because he probably loved Tetsuo more than any of their other friends. But Tetsuo, once again, has kind of taken this the wrong way, probably because everybody else always picks on him. And also, you realize that Tetsuo's parents more or less abandoned him, so a lot of these factors in Tetsuo's life have led him to becoming as emotionally disturbed as he is. And then when he finally gets these powers, you kind of get why he's using the powers in the way he is. He still must be stopped, and you definitely do start to lose sympathy for him as time goes on, but you kind of understand what brought him to this point. And then you have Kaneda, who is arguably the main protagonist of the film, and Kaneda is a great character because he does add a lot of humor and levity to what is overall a pretty dark story. And what I love about Kaneda is he is such a douchebag, yet he's a likable douchebag, and he's honestly kind of a doofus even throughout the whole movie. Even though he does very much mature as the movie goes on, he's still kind of a doofus. Like, honestly, his whole reason for joining this underground resistance against the government is really because he has the hots for Kei, and he kind of just wants to get laid. Now, a real example of Kaneda's douchebaggery is there's a scene where Kei kills a cop, and you could tell she's really distraught about this because she didn't want to kill this guy, and even after she kills this cop, Kaneda's still hitting on her. And while Kaneda is a likable character, he's certainly not what you would call a good person, because you can't forget that he was also the leader of a gang. And then you have the character of Kei, who in my opinion is criminally underdeveloped in the film. Now, in the manga, she's honestly what I would call the true protagonist of that story, even more so than Kaneda, because in the manga you realize that she's actually a psychic herself, and and she's so important in this final battle with Tetsuo that happens in the manga, and there are actually a couple of epic showdowns between her and Tetsuo that happen towards the end of that story. Now, the movie does touch on a little bit that Kei is a psychic medium, and there's certain points in the movie where the Espers take possession of her and start using their powers through her. But it's not really explained that well in the movie, and once again, while Kei is an important character in the film, she's not nearly as important as she was in the manga. And then you have the character of the Kernel, who is a very interesting character to me, especially because, to me, this character is such an interesting shade of gray, because you're not really sure what you're supposed to think of this character. Like, is he one of the villains? Because, in a way, he is one of the villains, yet at the same time, you still sort of root for him as well. Now, the character is definitely more three-dimensional in the manga series, where he goes through a genuine arc where he goes from being an antagonist to a protagonist. Now, I know I'm sort of a broken record at this point about how different this movie is from the manga. You could probably play a drinking game with how many times I've said, oh, this is different from the manga, and that is different from the manga. But now on to more differences between this movie and the manga. One of the major differences really is the character of Akira himself. In the film, Akira is much more of a metaphor than an actual character. Now, Akira does show up in this movie, but not in any physical sense. But in the books, Akira is legitimately a character in that story who Tetsuo actually wakes up, and at the end of the third volume of the series, he actually destroys Neo-Tokyo the same way that he destroyed the original Tokyo. And basically, the second half of the manga series is an outright post-apocalyptic story, kind of in the same vein as something like The Road Warrior, where you see survivors of Akira's attack on Neo-Tokyo trying to survive in the ruins of the city. And basically, Tetsuo and Akira become the rulers of their own empire, and Tetsuo essentially becomes Akira's right-hand man. Now, a very prominent character in the manga series is this woman named Lady Miyako, who is actually a psychic herself, and she's a very, very important character in the books, and she's technically in the movie, but she only shows up in a few shots in the movie, and actually in some dubs of the movie, she's actually dubbed by a male actor. And also, she dies in the movie pretty freaking hilariously. And actually, there are a couple of characters who are so prominent in the books who only show up in a few scenes in this movie, and in some cases don't even have any dialogue in the film. Now, in the movie, Tetsuo has a girlfriend named Kiori who, you get the idea that this is sort of an abusive relationship. Now, Kiori is in the books, but her character is much different in the books. Basically, in the books, Kiori is this girl who is taken off the streets shortly after the destruction of Neo-Tokyo, and she's pretty much made into one of Tetsuo's sex slaves, but as the story goes on, the two start to develop a really bizarre and really kind of fucked up relationship with each other, where you kind of get the idea that it's more Stockholm Syndrome than actual love. And there are so many other differences between this movie and the manga, and I could spend like 5 hours talking about all the differences, and there are so many different characters from the manga that this movie completely leaves out. For example, there's a character named Chiyoko from the books who is sort of a mother figure to Kei, who is such a prominent character in the graphic novels, and once again, she's not in this film at all. Now, I know it sounds like I'm really bitching about how different this movie is from the manga series. I'm not really bitching per se, I just like really pointing out the differences between a movie that's an adaptation of something and the source material. I'm a nerd, what can I say? But I understand, since this is only a 2-hour film, there's only so much that they can cram into one movie from a 2,000-page manga, and in reality, this really should have been either a series of films or a TV series. Now, there's some really effective scenes in this movie, and some really creepy scenes in this film as well, particularly the ending of the film where Tetsuo mutates, and Tetsuo's mutation is so freaking disturbing and so freaking creepy. There are also a few hallucination sequences in this movie which are also pretty creepy, like towards the beginning of the film when Tetsuo first gets these telekinetic powers, he has this hallucination where his guts fall out, which is pretty freaking disgusting. Also, there's the scene where the espers are fucking with Tetsuo, which I mentioned before, where the espers make, like, all these toys come to life, and there's this giant teddy bear with a snake for a hand that attacks Tetsuo. There are also some dream sequences in the film which are really effective, like, there's a scene in this film where Tetsuo's a little boy and you see the ground start to give way, but it's basically the ground within his shadow, so the hole in the ground is sort of forming in the shape of his shadow. You'll understand if you see the scene. Now, I might be reaching here, and I don't know if any foreshadowing was actually intended in this scene, but in that same scene I mentioned, the same dream sequence, you see a young Tetsuo and a young Kaneda drawing pictures on the asphalt of this playground, and Tetsuo is drawing a person with an elongated body. And I almost felt like Tetsuo drawing this person with sort of a distorted body with some weird foreshadowing of what will eventually happen to Tetsuo's body. Now, this DVD, which is the 25th anniversary edition, comes with 3 different dubs of the movie. It comes with the original Japanese audio, it comes with the 1989 English dub for when the movie first came over to America, and it comes with the 2001 English dub from Pioneer. Now, personally, I prefer the Pioneer dub of this movie. I know a lot of people really like the 1989 dubbing of the film. Personally, I found that to be way too cheesy, and I got this real sense that the voice actors really weren't taking the subject matter that seriously. Now, I know that's the version that a lot of people grew up on, but personally, I prefer the 2001 dub of the film. Now, I did watch the original Japanese dub of the film with English subtitles, of course, and even that version I do like, but honestly, for me personally, I just prefer the 2001 dubbing, and maybe that's because that's the version of the film I'm most used to. Now, Akira definitely opened up the floodgates for Japanese animation or anime here in the States, and it's hard to say if stuff like Dragon Ball Z and even Pokemon would have found the same kind of success here in the States if it wasn't for a movie like Akira. Akira also definitely paved the way for other animes like Ghost in the Shell. And also, when this movie came over to the States, the whole idea of animation for adults was a relatively new thing. I mean, granted, in the 1970s, you did have the Ralph Bakshi animated films like Fritz the Cat and Wizards and Coonskin, which were very much geared towards adults, but even so, cartoons and animated films were still considered to be for kids, and that might be why this movie didn't really do too well when it came over to the States back in 1989. At the same time, though, this movie definitely opened up the gates for anime here in the States because the movie did find a new life on home video. And there's even some American animation which was definitely inspired by this movie. For example, the show Batman Beyond, which was the sequel series to Batman the Animated Series, that show was very much inspired by Akira. For example, in Batman Beyond, you had this gang called the Jokers, which in the Batman Beyond universe was this gang who were emulating the Joker, but the Jokers were so clearly based on the clowns from both the manga and the movie Akira. And also, just the whole cyberpunk world of Batman Beyond was very much inspired by this movie. And there was also an episode of Batman Beyond called Splicers, where the main villain of that episode suffered a comeuppance very similar to Tetsuo's comeuppance at the end of this movie. This movie also had a huge influence on movies like The Matrix and Lucy, and the movie Chronicle was more or less a loose remake of this movie. And the show Stranger Things definitely seems to be inspired by this movie in some way, particularly all the stuff dealing with the government experimenting on psychic children. And the second season of Stranger Things definitely seemed to be Akira inspired. Now, I know there were a few video game adaptations of this movie. Now, I'm not a gamer, so I can't really comment too much on that. Now, for years there's been talks of an American live-action remake of Akira, and I know at one point Christopher Nolan was attached to it, at another point Jordan Peele was attached to it, and at one point there was even this idea of having Leonardo DiCaprio playing Kaneda, and even Robert Pattinson playing Tetsuo. Now, I forgot who it was, but at one point I was actually reading an interview with somebody who at one point was attached to direct a live-action remake of Akira, and it was so clear that this guy had absolutely no respect for the source material, and luckily it seems like nothing became of that. My thing is, if they do a live-action remake of Akira, it needs to be set in Japan. It could be like an American-Japanese co-production or something, but it needs to be set in Japan with Japanese characters. You could have a Caucasian character here and there, because there were actually Caucasian characters in the manga, but the story needs to be set in Japan, because I feel like this story is such a distinctively Japanese story. But to be honest though, I would rather see a TV series or a mini-series made based on Akira that actually follows the manga series, as opposed to a straight remake of this movie. But yeah, despite how different this movie is from the manga series, and I know most of this video was basically me pointing out all the differences, despite that, I still think this is a great movie, and once again, I'm not a hardcore anime fan by any means. Honestly, I'm very much a novice when it comes to anime. But yeah, that was my review on Akira, and bye.